Hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay, and today my guest in the studio is Tez Sawicki. Hi Tez.
Hi.
So Tez and I have actually been fellow travellers in the world of consciousness and spirituality over about 30 years and had many adventures together. And Tez has over the years developed the master game, which we're going to talk about later. But first of all, we're going to find out about his life. So Tez, I know you were telling me earlier, when you were very young, around 3 years old, you used to have an image that was very strong for you, very real for you actually.
Yeah, particularly when I would go to bed actually. When I would go to bed I would lie down, and rather than it being something, you know, kids are very reluctant to go to bed and that kind of thing, I'd just fall into my energy. Though at the time I would never have thought of it as my energy, but it was just a golden glow that was extremely comfortable, quite beautiful for me. And you know, that was a strong, very strong memory.
So describe this a bit more. I say a golden glow. I know you used to call it a gingerbread man.
Yeah, but I called it the gingerbread man as a kid because it had that kind of shape to it. You know, it had that kind of amorphous edge to it. So I was moving away from, I guess, this very strong physical sense of the body and into a very relaxed glow that was just nourishing, just an easy place to be. And
that lasted for how long?
It's hard for me to tell, you know, because I lost that memory. The reason I remembered it, I think, was because I remembered the process of losing it. Which was extremely distressing. As that I began to feel that light was switching off in me. So in my vision of it, it would just darken in places, like dark spots, that kind of thing, you know. Very, very disconcerting, very scary, in fact. You know, and in thinking about that or exploring that more as an adult therapeutically, I began just to see that process of just becoming switched off, just becoming conditioned, becoming suppressed, becoming closed down, that kind of thing. So it became kind of a tragic event, you know.
So that was part of the growing up process in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a part of everybody's growing up process. Whether or not people would have that kind of conscious memory is something else. I think in most people's minds it's much more diverse than that. You know, childhood, if it's been a healthy childhood, is usually kind of sweet, felt good, nice memory, but it's very, you know, amorphous. Whereas for me, that particular process was very clear.
And what were the factors that you found difficult in your childhood that did contribute to this going?
Again, in reflection, I would... One major thing is I'm dyslexic.
Yeah.
So that made a very, it became a very difficult, painful process for me. Though I couldn't even say that at the time, you know. You don't, I had no idea what dyslexia was, or what people wanted from me in that particular context. So the learning situation for me became extremely painful. And I began to feel very bad about who I was, because I couldn't do what other kids could do. You know, I couldn't learn things in a very linear way. That didn't work for me, and you know, I very quickly would become exhausted in the attempt to do that, and then just give up, because it just became a confusion. But at that time, dyslexia wasn't something that people knew about. Certainly not in the school I was at. So over time, that just became, it turned into the kind of place where I experienced myself as somebody who was just pretty inadequate. You know, that's what I was being told in some level. So that in itself isolated me in a big way.
And I know in the notes you gave me beforehand, you were saying that you learned not to trust adults.
Absolutely.
So you were quite isolated.
Yeah. You know, an adult in that kind of context would pressure me to answer a question. But I couldn't answer the question. There's just too much fear there and too much bewilderment about trying to cognitize something. So I could not function easily in that place. And because it became more and more critical, I became more and more isolated and less and less able to trust adults in that context.
Mm.
You know, so painful experience, really.
So you left school at 16.
Mm.
What happened then?
Well, I left school at 16, but I think there's some quite crucial things in that process. One, I lived in a very sectarian society, which again was a very painful process for me.
So you're living in Glasgow.
I'm living in Glasgow.
The Catholic
I'm living
and the
in the Catholic side of that whole
polarised.
process.
Yeah.
I have Catholic friends, I have Protestant friends, and a real antagonism between those two groups. I have a father who's Polish, Catholic. I have a mother who's Scottish, Protestant, and I'm being brought up in from a Catholic viewpoint. And the kind of dynamic at that particular time was only Catholics go to heaven, which meant my mother wasn't okay, which meant my friends that were Protestant weren't okay. And for me, that was completely unacceptable. You know, I could not go with that. I couldn't accept that kind of society, basically. So when I left school, for me, it was about leaving everything in some level. You know, I no longer trusted the society I was in because I didn't believe in it. I didn't believe in it, what it did to me emotionally. I didn't believe in it, what it did to me psychologically. Though at the time I couldn't cognitize that. I couldn't say that was how it was. I can only say that in reflection, really.
So you had the feeling you had to move on to something
I had to move
new
out of
somehow.
that. But I had no self-worth. So moving on was quite rebellious. You know, I don't think it was that unusual at the time, but certainly it was rebellious, it was inadequate, you know, it was very unskillful. So I moved into the kind of beatnik type hippie society, you know, with a lot of other young kids, trying to find a way forward that suited who we were, really. Which I guess became that whole drug-orientated society, you know. Though the redeeming quality in that for me was the artistry I was interested in, and perhaps the poetry I was interested in. And, you know, the whole kind of late beat culture was still kind of prominent then. So, you know, Jack Kerouac and all of those kinds of people. So they had an influence in my imaginary real life of how I wanted to be, you know, which was redeeming, really.
So they became sort of role models in some way, inspirations?
At some level, I would say they became role models while my mind was still fresh enough at that particular point. But, you know, as you move into a culture that is to do with, you know, drug, sex, rock and roll, that moves to the periphery. And, you know, and everything else kind of becomes dominant, your peer group and so forth.
So did you have any feeling of direction at the time, or did you feel you were kind of drifting somehow?
The only direction I felt I had was my artwork, because it was the only self-worth I had within that kind of process. And that was going nowhere because, you know, I left school at 15. I wasn't going to art school. It wasn't going to become something, if you like. Nevertheless, that was the only thing I could relate to. So I followed that, I guess.
And where did that take you?
Well, you know, my artwork took me into a level of concentration that probably became the redeeming quality for me, because there was some level of being able to gather things together and be productive in a positive way, whereas the rest of my life didn't feel like it was particularly positive or going anywhere in particular.
So it was like a holding.
Yeah,
it was like a focus that grounded you.
Yeah. Perhaps, you know, if I reflect on some of the kids I knew then, some of those kids went on so deeply into the drug world they ended up dying, you know.
Yeah.
And some of them got really messed up psychologically. For myself, I think having that kind of artistic ground, that pulled me through that process in some way. And also at that time I got into the I Ching, which became a big thing for me. And you know, it was the early stages of me getting involved in some degree in the Taoist viewpoint. So there was elements coming in there that were kind of taking me out of the negative, if you like.
But the negative is still strong, and if you hang out with people that are doing drugs and whatever, that's has a strong effect on you.
Well, I think when you have a group of people who have no real focus, I mean creative focus, what you have is just the whole negation of let's get wasted. You know, that's what's there, and that becomes very dominant. It also becomes sterile on some level because it's going nowhere. You know, it very quickly begins to exhaust itself, but still one is stuck in that kind of dynamic, and that goes on for me, it went on for a long period of time. You know, we're looking at a 10-year cycle of futility. You know, there's no fulfillment in being stoned.
So you gradually came out of that world. I think you got married.
I got married while I was still in that world.
Okay.
You know, and of course, I made the attempt for that to work in my inadequate way, and it didn't. So my marriage failed. So by that particular point, the drug world was no longer holding anything for me. My relationships were no longer relevant. So I was completely desolate at that particular point. You know, nothing was working.
So what does that feel like, to be completely desolate?
Hey, I wanted to be dead. I didn't see any clear way forward I knew of nothing that would really fulfill anything that was true in me. Everything had come to a place where there was no enthusiasm or no direct way forward. Across the board, in relationships, spiritually, psychologically, I'd come to an end, if you like, in some level, and had no choice but either to die or make a new beginning.
So why do you think that you went on the side of starting a new beginning and not going the way some of your friends went? What were the factors?
It's really difficult to define. I think the factors were probably just the pain of being in that particular position. The despair of that particular decision has an energy of its own that drives you either further down that road or out of that road. At some point, I guess in my mind, there came a place where, okay, I'm going to make an attempt here to turn this round, to find some way forward in this darkness, if you like. I think the things that really triggered something in me there was, again, the I Ching and the processes of yin and yang, or positive and negative, and exploring them, because I did a lot of very contemplative meditation on that process, and became interested in, if there's a way forward, it has to be creative. And if it is creative, is it the object? Is it that is the creativity, or is it the forces themselves? It's the creativity. I became interested in the forces themselves. So I wanted to know what...
So the impulse.
Yeah, I wanted to know what that was. And I wanted to be able to define that and not be exhausted by it. You know, if you look at the drug culture, it's all one of exhaustion. If you look at the cultures of creativity even, it tends towards one of exhaustion, unless you have tremendous panache. It tends, people end up dry, you know, because they're basically forcing the process of creation. So for me, it became about, how do you become creative about being you? How do you become creative about knowing what it is that makes you who you are?
So you wanted to learn, in fact, how to maximize the potential of your creativity without exhausting yourself.
And without hurting me and hurting other people.
So, to keep it on a practical level, I think at that point, pretty much you decided to move to London to have a break.
I went south at that point, complete break.
That's right, to get away from your environment, start something new. And how was that, coming to a completely new place and starting a new life?
Unbelievably lonely. But I think that was necessary for me, because I think at that particular point, what I didn't realize with any kind of clarity was how lonely and unfulfilled I was. And the loneliness and isolation from having a kind of positive emotional connection to anybody was the problem for me at that particular point. You know, how do you make how does an inadequate young guy make the jump from that depth of isolation into communication when you don't have the skills to do that? So it's really about finding a depth of communication with another person in a way that was relatively safe, but also in a way that was relatively confrontative. You know, you have to face who you are in order to kind of come to terms with that kind of process. So I got interested in the therapeutic process and moved from that place.
And what kind of studies were you doing at that time? You were doing the therapy?
I was doing various therapies. I did a lot of group work, encounter-based group work, and at that time, encounter was quite crude. You know, it was very.
I can remember. Yeah.
Very full-on encounter.
Yeah.
You know, which was both exciting, very stimulating, very scary, and very angry. I was very angry.
Brought you alive, though, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it brought me alive. But the other part of that for me, I think because I had so much difficulty learning to trust another person, the bodywork aspects of therapy, like, you know, bioenergetics, Reichian bodywork, they became really powerful for me. There was a way of accessing and really letting go of your charge, basically, your anger and so forth. What I found there was actually I can trust my body. And that was a very big realization.
What do you mean by you could trust your body?
Well, my body doesn't lie to me. You know, my body doesn't misrepresent how things are. It pretty much is how it is.
So what you're saying is it gives you signs through pains and aches and feelings, and then it's a question of understanding and using intelligence to translate, if you like, what the body's telling you.
Well, the mind is reflecting the body. You know, it's the body that pulls in the information. It's the body that's producing all of that. And if one begins to take one's attention to how that's expressing itself, then it becomes a very insightful, reflective process.
Okay. We'll come on in more detail to that a little bit later when we talk more about the master game. But let's just keep your story going for the time being. So I think a little later you got involved with the Sannyasin movement, which is to do with Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, which became known as Osho later.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the reason I got involved in that was I thought the meditations, the body-orientated meditations, were really helpful. And they were, I guess, Osho's way of bringing the Western mind into facing its own tension in quite an easy way. It's bioenergetics with a mindfulness aspect to it, basically. You know, they're all stress release processes, and that's what pulled me into the sannyas world. The other part of it was a family. It was a family of people really interested in developing.
In growing, understanding.
Yeah, it was all of that. You know, and one felt safe within that for a while.
Yeah. And I know you were spending a lot of time working in the commune, as it was called, and that was really hard work, wasn't it? It was long hours.
The commune, you know, in some levels, a big disappointment for me, the commune, because I went into the commune naively, as most people would, I guess. I guess, to develop my interest in the Satori experiences I had prior to going into the commune. But when I went into the commune at that particular point, it was very work-orientated. And I was away from the commune, working quite hard with a whole group of great people doing building work. But we spent time in the commune was the weekends. The rest of the time was really out there working very long hours.
So let's look at the Satori experience you mentioned. I think the first one was after you'd watched a program about. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I'd watched. It's so vague in my mind. I'd watched a Japanese documentary on a Japanese monastery, and it's out in the country. It's probably very well known. I don't remember the name of it. And basically, it was like a finishing school for a lot of young, probably relatively wealthy young guys that would go there, and the discipline was enormous. It was really hard, obviously really hard work. And one of the things they had to do in this particular monastery was they had to scrub the steps every morning, and they would go full tilt. Doing the young guys really going full tilt, scrubbing these steps, and that kind of triggered something in me. So I started playing with that practice, and I would scrub away.
So it's a totality, isn't it? It's
yeah,
just making that scrubbing all there is.
Put everything into it.
Yeah.
And that's what I was doing. And I stopped one day, sat down, and went into a major opening. So everything just opened. My awareness just expanded. My energy just expanded. I stopped being concentrated on the object and fell into the field. And that was my first major Satori. But I didn't understand the process.
But can you just describe more what that experience was like, so somebody who's watching that doesn't quite understand what you're...
Okay,
you say you fell into the field.
Yeah.
What's the signs of that?
I would say that it's not that unusual. And the lower levels of that just about everybody who's in a relatively good place in themselves probably experience. It tends to be more laid back. You're in the countryside, the sun's shining, the place is lovely, everything relaxes, and your awareness opens into taking all that on.
So I think the key for me here is everything relaxes. It's just, and it's not that you're trying to relax.
No, not
it just
at all.
happens.
As soon as you try to relax, it just gets tense.
Yeah.
So everything just happened in that context. But there is no fields, no grass, no birds, nothing like that in this context. I was just sitting in that spaciousness. So now I'm sitting, having moved away from my psychological tension, and the way I was holding shape in my body, in that tense way, into just an openness that had real space to it. No content, just presence.
So somehow we're not exactly breaking out, but we're coming out of the structure that is normally us in life.
We're coming out of the tension.
Tension.
We're coming out of the tension. Psychologically, people are in huge levels of tension. So how can you experience that kind of relaxed openness when one is holding this really tight psychological shape,
Yeah.
How can you do that?
And how long did that feeling last?
It didn't last that long. But it certainly stimulated me toward trying to understand what that was.
Yeah.
And I also, at that particular point, was practicing Tai Chi and Qi Gong, and that was taking me towards a similar dynamic, and also with going into the Rajneesh meditations was taking me towards that same dynamic, so I was following that line, really.
So you spent several years in the Rajneesh Sannyas commune.
Yeah, quite a lot of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And overall, when you look back on that time now, how do you feel about it?
I think it was great. I'm really grateful for that experience. I wouldn't choose to be in that now, because it would be wrong for who I am now. But across the board, it was extremely helpful. I met incredibly good people. It took me completely out of the parochial consciousness that I had and opened me into a much more worldly viewpoint across the board and all sorts of different things. Very clever people, very nice people, but also as a group of people together moving into something, and that something beginning to fall apart. You know, so one went into the whole romanticizing processes of, you know, spirituality and all that kind of thing, only to see it collapse, you know.
Yeah.
So all of it was extremely useful. For me to watch that collapse was similar to watching my own collapse psychologically earlier in my life.
Interesting.
But it was in a different context, because now I had skills that could ground me and allow me to kind of move on, really.
And then you moved on to a community in northern Italy, which I was at.
Yes.
And we both took part in this experiment called the 6-month project. And the aim was 60 people living together in one villa in northern Italy with the aim of enlightenment. Quite a modest aim. And how was that for you?
Mixed again. My criteria from being there would be different than yours, because I went there working, and the 6-month project became something after that, really. So I went into it from more of a working perspective for 2 levels. One, I wanted to again be with a group of people, with my partner at the time, and try to find a new way forward. I wanted to move out of what I was doing for a living as well. So I was trying to find a way in that villa context to be able to develop consciousness and find a different way of working with myself and the world. The 6 months process is so difficult to talk about. It's a very diverse process, one way or another. It became for me intensely energized in a way that I had to deal with the feeling tone that my own tension was generating constantly. That's what the 6 months was for me.
So what you're saying is the energy field was so strong, it was resonating in you, and part of that resonation was to do with things that weren't clear, were being exposed, brought to the surface.
Brought to the surface, processed, really.
Processed,
But for me, what was interesting was not so much the dynamic of talking about something, but it's more about the dynamic of that depth of potential having the ability to dissolve one's psychological resistance. That's what was interesting for me. So I kind of got into the place of, if I look at that psychological resistance, it has some very particular components. Not just that you have an attitude that, you know, creates a lot of difficult feeling tone, but actually there's a holding of shape. There's a holding of psychological shape, which means there's a holding of physiological shape. So one's whole biology has been held in a very particular way. If you change the attitude that governs that, then that begins to alter. So that field expresses itself differently. So I got interested in, if I change the space, if I change the psychological space and how I'm presenting my consciousness, if you like, then the experience changes. So because my body is responding in a different context. It's in a different way. It's very, very, very Pythagoras, you know, it's that whole, how do I hold a shape, whether it's a square or, you know, the shape that I'm in right now in this particular room. You know, you were sitting here in this particular space where we're connecting, but if you're holding the space, then you're in the whole of the space. So psychologically things change, because the potential is shaping itself in a different way.
So, a lot of the process we did in the villa for those 6 months was about exposing our psychological boundaries, or becoming aware of them and exposing them, and working through them with talking and various therapeutic processes. But it seems that from what I remember and you're repeating now, you had a slightly different take on it, where there was another way of dealing with this more energetically as such.
Yeah. I wanted to get to the bottom of how one would develop an attitude, or how one would create feeling tone. I wanted to get the sense of what the underlying structure of that was. So that's what my exploration was within the villa, is to really kind of move in that direction.
I know, I remember you built a couple of structures in one of the stables in the grounds. The first one was the box. Just very briefly tell us about the box.
Well, the box was, again, my attempt to build an environment that really contained the forces of any person or any group that was within it, in a way that psychologically held the energy in that space. And just by making the box, that was the first thing that I did there, by making the box unusual, immediately altered people's perception of how things are. Because you couldn't go into the box other than through a small hatch. And when you went in and closed the hatch, you just had the whole square, absolutely square, white environment. No way out, no way in. And psychologically, that was a massive process for everybody in a circle, facing one another and going into whatever was arising in that process. It all reflected back on itself. There was no escape in that box.
So if you stayed with it, i.e. you didn't resist it, didn't energize it by talking about it, you stayed with it, then somehow it would start to balance itself. Is that the right word?
It finds its own point of balance tension.
Okay.
That's what energy does. When you stop interfering, it finds its own point of balance tension. When it finds its own point of balance tension, something remarkable happens. Stillness arises. There's no longer a boundary. Stillness begins to express itself. But as soon as you go into reacting, resisting, thinking, then the stillness disappears, and the point of balance tension changes. So it follows your direction of thought, or your reactiveness to sensation, and so forth.
And later on, you built a structure called the cage. The
cage was different.
Which was slightly different, wasn't it?
Well, one of the things people were doing in the villa was playing with crystals and so forth. And I wanted to build something that was made in copper and made in quartz. So we had copper tubing that was packed with crushed quartz. So it was massively, energetically stimulating. So we had a method of, the cage was also a pyramid shape. And the pyramid shape did something quite interesting. It took one into the midline of one's system. It lengthened everything. So the dynamic of that form would lift things up and lengthen things out, but the cage would contain it. So the field that the cage was producing was massive. But the other thing with the cage was it was a very gross energy. You know, the materials were gross. So in it, what we had was a selection of very expensive gems. You know, there was some quite well-off people in the villa with some really nice jewellery.
Yes.
And I was using the stones.
All female, pretty much.
Pretty much. I was using their stones. You know, we're talking 150, 200,000 pounds worth of stones, probably, maybe more, I don't know. So relatively good quality gemstones to refine that energy and allow that to be a lot softer. So again, it was about how can we use a structure to open the system's bioenergy and allow it to express itself in its fullness rather than being contracted into a thought, contracted into conceptualizing everything. So another experiment in that,
Yeah.
in that context.
And we had a period of 3 days in the
Yeah.
6-month experiment. We all lived in one big room for 3 days, all 60 of
Right.
us. I know something strong happened for you then during that time, didn't it?
Yeah, there was a very intense build up to that particular, I call it again a Satori type experience.
Yeah.
But you know, prior to that, what was coming from me was a gradual opening that would, despite my psychological tension, there was another part that was more interested in opening. And I was going into, I'm pretty sure a lot of people were going into that kind of experience. A deep-seated psychological tension, yet at the same time there was a very powerful opening field phenomena. Energy body was really kind of opening. And the 3 days was where that really peaked for me. And my flow just opened. I say flow because what it did was longitudinally opened and then expanded. And I stayed in that place constantly without effort, so it was effortless experience, and that's never gone. I've contracted into my thinking and so forth, but it's always been there since that particular point. I haven't lost touch with that.
So how would you describe that space?
It's similar to what I was talking about before. Technically, I would say when you drop out of your thinking, when you relax, when relaxation happens, the processes that allow thinking turn into what I would call as consciousness. Consciousness is pretty boundless. It only has boundaries when you give it psychological boundaries. So for me, what that means is just being open. Very similar to what was happening for me as a child.
It's interesting how
how
you were
full circle.
Discovering, refinding what you experienced but didn't really understand when you were 3 or 4 years old.
So it took me back to that place. I would say is a natural, normal process, normal place for people to be in.
You actually, the notes you gave me when you talked about this place that you've refound in the 3 days, it was, you wrote, this is a state change that most people would call non-dual and think of as enlightenment. I would say it's neither. Rather, it's the beginning of that possibility. The universal field is rooted in and reflects the taste of the non-dual, but it is still conditional.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think you put that very well there.
Potential is always conditional. It changes constantly. It's changing its expression in multiple ways. Yet, as soon as potential opens towards its fullness, what you have is just a wide open consciousness. Very simple, very normal. You could say it's not. I mean, I think a lot of people do say it's non-dual, but it's only relatively non-dual, as against other experiences. But it's a temporary experience. One might be able to gather enough potential to be able to access that pretty regularly, because I think that field is always there. You know, I think there's always an organizing field that's universal, that is the bottom line for consciousness.
So you run these retreats called Gathering Essence, the Master Game. What's the Master Game exactly?
Well, the Master Game is a combination of methods of learning how to master your own processes and learning how to have mastery over accessing your own potential. Bottom line is, can you access your potential and relax into it? So for me, the Master Game is exploring the ways and means of being able to engage that process. You know, traditionally, people talk about meditative processes in a way that's kind of worrying. You know, there's this long, ongoing story of how to access these very complex meditative processes. For me, the Master Game is about being able to do that immediately and not having to spend long periods of time trying just to get someplace. So I'm looking to go to a degree of realization with real ease. The difficulty I've found in teaching this kind of work is it's very easy to take people into a so-called non-dual experience, where it's very difficult for them to understand that.
And what tend to be the drawbacks for people?
The drawbacks for people is how they hold psychological space.
So that's what we were talking about earlier, yes.
It's how you hold shape. You know, so that's based on your beliefs and your attitudes, basically. So your beliefs and your attitudes shape how you experience. Master Game is about seeing your beliefs and your attitudes and being able to soften that out for a time. It doesn't mean you necessarily change hugely psychologically who you are, but it does mean you have the ability to be able to relax that for a time and move into a level of depth that is in tune with the more universal forces around you.
Because you talk about primordial, is it?
Primordial breathing.
Primordial breathing.
Okay, that gets a wee bit more complex.
Well, let's try.
Yeah, okay. Primordial breathing implies something very particular. It implies that you can access that open field. So it means that you can come out of your conceptualizing thinking processes and open the neural system into one unified field that is just experiencing. Yeah, so it's just there.
So we could say that's a basic non-dual experience.
That's a basic non-dual experience. Primordial breathing is to be able to breathe that back into the body. So the internal potential of the system moves to a much higher level of function. One of the processes that goes on with one's psychology is that the physiology is corrupted by my reaction to experience. So the physiology starts not to work very well. There's a lot of internal resistance going on. So there's no easy flow going on.
So we could say in layman terms that energy gets blocked in the body.
It gets blocked in the body. Yeah. So when I open up into the more universal field and start to be able to breathe that, what happens is that field comes in very strongly and it reorganizes the internal world. Everything, because the potential is stronger than your attitudes, because the potential is stronger than some of the resistances that one habitually holds, it takes you out of it. And the whole organ system, internal structures can begin to function at a higher level. So the neural network actually begins to get enlivened. There's an integration going on that's not these kind of deep psychological grooves.
So when we hear, and we have indeed programs on Conscious TV about people who've had very dramatic physical healings, would you say that's what's happened?
That's what's happening. That's what's happening. I don't think you can make it happen.
Yeah.
I think when you go into primordial breath work, that kind of consciousness, when you're taking that in, then it begins to slowly happen, which I think for most people is a much healthier way forward.
Yeah.
You know, I'm personally not looking for huge physiological changes in that work because it's pretty traumatic to make those kinds of changes for most people. I'm more interested in a kind of slow unfolding of well-being, of allowing that kind of process.
So could we say it's also a process of, maybe process is the wrong word, but I'll use that word now, a process of, at an even deeper level, getting more in touch with who we really are?
Absolutely, yeah. But you can't do that without your full system. You need all of your senses to be able to move towards a neutral state. So as they move towards a neutral state, one becomes very embodied. But through that embodiment, one reaches into one's potential. And it's only through the potential that you can reach into deeper levels of spirituality.
So it's as if we have to rediscover, re-embody ourselves in the body, and that in itself is the gateway to the other dimensions, if you like.
To everything.
And because there is a school of thought where it is about, you know, at the higher levels the body becomes unimportant. But you're saying actually something that is contradictory to that.
Yeah. I think for certain people, the body becomes unimportant when they are in higher levels.
Okay, wait.
I think if you try to apply that to somebody, ordinary guy, that's absurd. It's utterly absurd.
Yeah.
You know, one needs to be able to use the fullness of one's system in order to cognitize any in-depth spirituality.
Yeah. So I'd like you to talk about you probably remember most of what's in there, the last section of your small booklet about the master player, where you touched on some of this. A resourced master player is conscious of essence, Qi and Shen, is it pronounced? Yeah. Can you talk more about that, about how it evolves for the master player?
Okay, again, difficult one. The Taoist viewpoint is essence, Qi and Shen. The essence is thought of as the primary nutrient that comes from one's parents, that manifests itself over time and will eventually run out.
So when you say primary nutrient, what do you mean by the primary nutrient?
The actual energetic substance that allows the system to come into creation, to unfold itself.
Okay, the life force.
The life force that's come, you know, that's that package that comes from our parents. Actually what it does is it triggers the cellular system into production. That's what that primary essence does. In other words, from a Taoist perspective, you'd say it turns into Qi. From a biological perspective, you'd say it stimulates the production of the cellular system.
Okay.
So the essence, the lower essence in the body, is really the gut, and the lower organs, particularly the kidneys, and that really is the production. You know, that's where all the nutrient is being processed and turned into a substantial energy that the body can kind of work with. So the work of working with essence is really of being able to take all of the available forces and turn them into energy. Energy really is, in that system, is really thought of as this area. For instance, in our dialogue, if I go into reaction in our dialogue, I'll most definitely hold my breath, which will stop my energy moving. So this is the center for that. But if I go the other way and soften into it, what my energy will do is get more refined. And as it gets more refined, what it will do is turn into consciousness. So actually what it's doing is turning from Qi into Shen. And Shen, you could think of, is consciousness. It's that really refined level of perception that's gone from quite a gross nutrient into a very refined state. So the internal work is really bringing this system into that modern terminology, into a neural relationship that is very fluent and very fluid. So the gut instinctive body and the heart emotional body and the psychology of the perceptual body all begin to integrate in a much fuller context. So I'm using now the fullness of my system to read what is happening in the moment. So that is that process of coming. The end result of that is, as you move into that level of production of Shen, if you like, is that it then moves towards stillness. It naturally moves towards the place you were talking about earlier on, where the body in itself is becoming less important as my spiritual understanding begins to unfold itself. It's a very mature level, and very few people, I think, actually are ready or particularly want to go there. So it's that kind of dynamic.
And what kind of commitment is the person making who works with you on the master game?
It's extremely varied process, because I'm not a pushy person, you know. And I don't want to do other people's work for them. So I'm very open to their level of commitment. I do have a few priorities that they're consistent with practice. And in retreat, that they're consistent with the work that we're doing in order for things to unfold. So in the retreat context, it's really finding your way in and staying with that process as best you can. But in a relaxed context, most of the people I work with in the Master Game are people I see regularly. So they're people that go to classes.
Yes.
In a very regular way.
Yeah.
So they're doing a lot of psychological, physiological work on themselves that is energy-based.
So it becomes really their primary commitment in life, doesn't it? I
think one's potential becomes the commitment. One has to be real careful. It's not about the practices, you know.
Okay.
It's not about following some cult orientation, you know, any of that stuff. It's about understanding your own potential and bringing that into its fullness. You know, for me, that might be I want to take it deeper into spirituality. For you, it might be you want to take it deeper into something in your life, your family, your work, or, you know, whatever. It's about the potential. It's about understanding your potential.
The thing is, if you ask most people about their potential, the potential is going to be based on the outside.
In the relational
and
field.
that is, it's rather sad in the way we've lost. That isn't to say the outside's a bad thing, but we've lost the balance between the two.
But that's an interesting thing. You know, I view it as the relational field. So the relational field for me is both external and internal. But the internal aspects, I would say, of the relational field are superficial. And what the relational field does is it takes the potential and spends it. And what usually happens in our society is it gets spent into exhaustion. Yeah?
Yes.
So it's very difficult for people to learn there's something beyond that, to turn around and go, well, let's just look at the potential and let's see if we can cultivate the potential. That's a big turnaround. That's a majorly difficult turnaround. And that's why it's very hard to move into these Satori type experiences, because the tide is all going one way. And one has to learn to go out, but to also return and actually get depth in one's field consciousness, depth in one's embodiment. If you can do that, that's great. And then that goes wherever you want to take it.
I'm just remembering, we have to finish in a couple of minutes, I'm just remembering when we were sitting we were talking about the 6-month project, and the 3 days within that we all lived in one room for 3 days, and we sat around in a big circle, 6 of us. And I remember more than once sitting there, most of us eyes closed, silent, and your booming voice would come out. Presence is a necessity.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling that now, the whole thing, whatever that means to anybody, presence is a necessity, because that is...
That's the fulcrum.
Yeah.
That's the fulcrum for spirituality. Everything returns to that. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just going to show your little brochure again. Gathering Essence, the Master Game with Tez. I'm going to thank you for coming along to Conscious TV, and you know, we're old friends, but it's still lovely to talk to you on this level, and I always learn something new for myself every time that we have such a conversation.
Me too, thank you.
And we're now going to do a very short exercise, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. We'll tag on the end of this program, which will be something practical, so that if you have enjoyed what Tez has been talking about, you might get more of a tangible feel of the kind of work he does and more of a depth of what he's talking about. So thank you for watching Conscious TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye. Hello, you're watching Conscious TV. I'm sitting here with Tez Sawicki, and we're going to do a short gathering essence seated meditation.
Okay, first thing we need to do is kind of re-alter how we're sitting, because what I want is a sense of feeling grounded in my seat. So how I do that is I come forward slightly, a little more toward the edge of the seat, and get a sense of your feet being really quite grounded, in the context that you could stand up if you chose to. So you can feel your feet. Yeah. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring my awareness to the midline of my body. So I'm just getting a sense of the spine, a sense of just feeling into the seat, feeling into my legs, and perhaps breathing that. So my awareness is just deepening in. I'm coming into the feeling tone of being in my body, being in this upright position, feeling relatively grounded. And then once I have a sense of that, I'll come back to the surface a little bit. And now what I want to do is, I want to reorganize the central nervous system in a gentle context. And if you look at the process of how the central nervous system expresses itself, there's a descending through the spinal cord, and then the nerves reach out and circulate and embrace the body. The energy does the same kind of thing. What I want to do is balance the left and the right. And the way I'm going to do that is just triggering it by coming into this kind of movement. So I'm just moving, first of all, from side to side, but my attention is on the feeling sensation, the feeling tone of the movement. And there's a sinking quality as I do that. There's a dropping down. There's a feeling in, there's a listening in. And I would stay with this for a while. But we don't have a lot of time, so we can't really, but let's just get a flavour of it. Okay, now I'm going to alter that slightly by bringing in a slight diagonal. So I'm moving to the side and pushing this knee out. Moving to the side, pushing this knee out. I'm doing that by pushing from my foot. So now I'm actually triggering the nerves from one side, releasing them, triggering them on the other side, releasing them. Yeah. Now you can see it's quite concentrated to really get into the feeling tone, the motion of that movement is bringing all of your attention into the body. Okay, now a few more, and what I'm going to do now is just slowly sort of release that and allow my awareness just to fall into the sensation. It's just a deepening into sensation, a settling in. I'm passing my attention through body, aware of the breath, that kind of thing. Let the chest really soften. So again, if you look at the overall feeling tone, you've probably got a much wider sense of your embodiment. So that's the start of that particular process. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to open up the shoulders a little bit. A very simple movement. I'm going to listen with the intention of lifting my arm. What I'm listening to is, where does that actually begin? Of course, it begins in your psychology, it begins in your mind, but it triggers the energy somewhere. I want to get a sense of that, and I'm lifting my arm, and I'm going to emphasize the elbow. I'm going to bring the elbow forward towards the midline of your body, and turn it, drop it down, and again. So you're following the direction of flow. I'm feeling into the shoulder joint itself, and from there you'll begin to feel the various tendons and so forth become activated. But I'm going to stay with that slow, conscious movement, connected movement. And I'm now bringing in a kind of listening attentiveness, and soften, really soften. As I raise the elbow, there's an effort. As I sink the elbow, it's going into letting that effort go. So in effect, I'm coming out to the surface in the motion, and then I'm dropping back inside as I let it go. Oh, one more. And I'm just going to bring my hand round. Now I'm staying with the feeling tone of the whole arm, and I'm going to root it back to my knee, soften in. Again, just follow that feeling tone internally. Keep letting go, keep sinking in, softening in. Breathe it. And just with that kind of listening intent, just feel it just goes into its own expansion. If you compare the side you're working with to the other side, you get a sense of that, clear sense of that. You see the other side actually is not very alive particularly. The blood flow and the Qi flow, the energy flow is not really there. It's not particularly nurturing the system. The other side of it is now your mind is in tune with what feels resourced and what feels unresourced. So the mind's getting the opportunity now to become very aware of the potency or the potential of the system, but its own potential as it relaxes into the feeling tone. Let's come into the other shoulder, same motion. Notice the nuances of the movement. You maybe find there's little places it just doesn't quite work. Yeah, a little tight and so forth. But what I'm doing is just staying with that shoulder joint, feeling where these little nuances are, these little held triggers, yeah, where it doesn't quite flow, where there's a degree where the system has lost its integrity, because the flow is so compromised in some level for most people over a particular age. The other thing to maybe take on board is I'm having to slow the mind down.
I feel that, yeah.
So there's a major key.
Yeah.
Very slow motion means the mind has to change its frequency to be able to engage. So it moves into a completely different expression, different dimension almost. Now I'm going to add one little thing there. Is I bring my elbow around, again I want to bring it forward, because what I want to do is take this right back into the spine, scapula. So move out as far as is easy. I'll show you again. Let's get it engaged again. Elbow's lifting, but now it's going to come forward, and then the hand is going to move in toward your chest, so the elbow's pointing toward me.
Yep.
Yeah. Now if you look, that's a much bigger movement you've gone into.
Yep.
So you're triggering a lot more structure.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Let's make this the last one here. And come out. And again, I'm just going to follow that round. I'm in the feeling tone, gauging the fullness of the sensation. I'm going to ground it back to my knee. Soften and breathe. Now if you feel in, you'll see your upper body's now much more energized. There's more fluid actually.
Yeah, I'm beginning to sweat a little bit, so even though it's a small movement.
Yeah, profound.
Yeah.
This work is utterly profound. The more you go in, the deeper it goes.
Yeah.
So we just started that process, but one of the things you might notice is you've gone into the upper system, the middle part of the upper system, but you've lost contact with the lower system.
Yes.
Yeah?
No, I understand,
Yeah? What I want to do is to re-engage those, because I want all the lower neurons and the middle neurons to integrate.
Yes.
Yeah? And what I'm going to do then is just here and here. So the four major joints, shoulder joints and hip joints, are now having to express some degree of relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, that is kind of non-dual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm equalizing. I'm not favouring any one joint. So I'm slowly opening into it. Now bring your whole leg in, the knees going out again. Knees going out again.
Yeah.
So the elbow comes forward, the knee goes out. Returning. Elbow goes forward, knee goes out. And again. And again I'm bringing in those concentration skills. One more. And relax it all. Palms come forward now. Lift your spine. I want the fullness of the central nervous system to be available to my consciousness. Again, I'm just settling in. Feel your hands connect to your knees. Feel your feet connect to the floor. Feel your body relax your shoulders. And again, just drop into that overall feeling tone. Breathe it, soften into it. And listen. And if you go with it, it will probably take you to a point of balanced tension and perhaps some stillness. Yeah.
Thank you, Tez.
You're welcome. That was fun.